Elara lived her life in the quiet spaces between other people's words. For 47 years, she had been the silent hum beneath the grand opera of the Ashworth family. She was Arthur Ashworth's second wife, a woman he married not for passion, but for peace. His first wife had been a storm, and his children, Richard and Clara, were the thunder and lightning she left behind. Elara arrived like a soft rain, meant to soothe the scorched earth of their lives. She did not try to replace their mother. She simply tried to exist, to serve, to make the sharp edges of their grief a little smoother. She remembered their birthdays when Arthur forgot. She mended the clothes they tore in their youthful carelessness, and later the relationships they fractured in their adult arrogance. She cooked meals that filled the vast, echoing silence of the Ashworth mansion. Her presence a faint, warm scent of rosemary and thyme in a house that always smelled of lemon polish and old money. She was a ghost in her own home, visible only when something was needed. A lost button, a forgotten appointment, a comforting hand on a feverish brow in the dead of night. Arthur, a man who prized comfort above all else, had been grateful for her quiet efficiency. He loved her, she believed, in his own way. It was a love of convenience, a love that appreciated her for how little she asked for and how much she gave. His children, however, saw her not as a comfort, but as a placeholder, an employee with the title of a wife. They called her Elara, never mother or even stepmother. The name was always spoken with a careful, deliberate neutrality that felt colder than any insult. She was 71 years old when Arthur died. His heart, which had beaten so steadily and so cautiously for 85 years, simply stopped. The silence he left behind was different from the ones she was used to. It was not a space she could fill with soup or a neatly folded blanket. It was a void, a definitive, final emptiness. Richard and Clara descended upon the house like vultures who had been circling for decades. They wore black, but their eyes were bright with calculation. They moved through the rooms where Elara had spent nearly half a century, their gazes cataloging, appraising, claiming. They spoke to her in hushed, condescending tones, as if she were a fragile antique they had to move carefully before they could sell the cabinet it sat on. The day of the will reading was a cold, gray Tuesday. The family lawyer, Mr. Thompson, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with an expression of mild disapproval, sat behind Arthur's massive mahogany desk. Elara sat in a small chair opposite him, her hands folded in her lap. Richard and Clara sat on the leather sofa, their bodies leaning forward with a predator's anticipation. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense room. He began to read from the thick vellum document. Sections. The Ashworth Mansion, its contents, the art collection, the portfolio of stocks and bonds, the summer home in the Hamptons, the chalet in Aspen. Everything went to my beloved children, Richard and Clara Ashworth. Elara listened, her face placid. She had expected this. She had never believed herself a true Ashworth, merely a long-term guest. She assumed Arthur would have made some small provision for her, a modest apartment perhaps, a pension to see her through her remaining years. It was the least a man could do for a woman who had dedicated her life to his comfort. Mr. Thompson paused, peering over his spectacles. And finally, he said, his voice dropping slightly, to my wife, Elara, for her many years of devoted companionship. Richard shifted, a smirk playing on his lips. Clara inspected her manicure, feigning boredom. I bequeath the vehicle registered in my name, a 1978 Starcraft Wanderer camper, and the small, undeveloped parcel of land where it is currently stored in Havenwood, Oregon. Silence. A thick, suffocating silence. Elara felt the air leave her lungs. A camper. She vaguely remembered Arthur buying it decades ago, a whim inspired by a magazine article about exploring the great American wilderness. He had used it once, for a weekend trip from which he returned complaining of insects and uncomfortable bedding. It had been towed away to some forgotten plot of land and never mentioned again. Clara let out a small, sharp laugh, a sound like breaking glass. "A camper," she said, her voice dripping with venomous amusement. Father really did have a sense of humor. Richard chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "It's poetic, really. The housekeeper gets the servants' quarters. Mobile edition." Elara's gaze flickered from their mocking faces to the lawyer's impassive one. She felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck, a humiliation so profound it was almost physical. She had been erased. She had been eliminated. 47 years of her life, a lifetime of devotion, had been valued at a broken-down camper and a patch of dirt in a state she had never even visited. Mr. Thompson pushed a small, tarnished brass key across the desk. Beside it, he placed a small, beautifully carved wooden bird, no bigger than her thumb. "These were left for you as well," he stated, his tone flat, offering no comfort. "The deed to the land and the vehicle title will be mailed to you. You have 30 days to vacate this property." 30 days. The words echoed in the cavernous study. 30 days to dismantle a life. 30 days to become officially homeless. Elara stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. Her legs felt unsteady, as if the floor beneath her had turned to sand. She picked up the key and the little wooden bird. The bird was smooth and cool in her palm, its tiny, intricate details a stark contrast to the ugliness of the moment. She did not look at Richard or Clara as she walked out of the room. She could feel their triumphant, scornful eyes on her back. She was nothing to them. Less than nothing. She was a loose end, and they had just neatly tied her off. The next 30 days passed in a blur of methodical packing and quiet despair. Richard and Clara left her alone, their cruelty now taking the form of complete and utter indifference. They did not offer help. They did not ask where she would go. They simply waited for her to disappear. Elara sorted through her belongings, the meager collection of a life lived in service to others. She had so little that was truly hers. Books, a few worn sweaters, photographs of a family that was not her own, and a small box of personal keepsakes from a life before Arthur. She packed what she could into 2 large suitcases. Everything else she left behind. She sold her small, modest car for a few $1,000s, the only money she had to her name. The Social Security checks she received were barely enough to live on, certainly not enough for a deposit on an apartment. The camper was her only option. It was a ridiculous, humiliating prospect. A 71-year-old woman moving into a derelict camper she had not seen in 30 years. Fear was a constant, cold knot in her stomach. What if it was uninhabitable? What if the land was a swamp? Where would she go then? A shelter? The streets? Her mind recoiled from the images, the terrifying possibilities that lurked just beyond the horizon of her current misery. She felt a profound loneliness, a sense of being utterly adrift in the world. Arthur had been her anchor, and now he was gone, and his children had cut the rope. She spent her last night in the Ashworth mansion, not in her own bedroom, which had already been stripped of its personality by Clara's impatient decorators, but in the guest room. She lay awake, staring into the darkness, the unfamiliar shapes of the furniture like silent, judging specters. She thought about Arthur. Had he intended this cruelty? Had his final act been one of such profound disregard? The man she knew, the conflict-avoidant man who craved peace, seemed incapable of such a deliberate, final blow. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The will was clear. She closed her eyes and clutched the small wooden bird in her hand. It was the only thing that felt real, the only piece of her bizarre inheritance that did not feel like a joke. Its smooth, carved surface was a small point of focus in a world that had become a dizzying, terrifying chaos. On the 30th day, a taxi arrived to take her to the airport. She took one last look at the grand, imposing facade of the house that had been her prison and her sanctuary for 47 years. No one came out to say goodbye. The windows stared back at her like blank, unseeing eyes. She was leaving as she had arrived, quietly and utterly alone. The flight to Oregon was long and turbulent. Elara sat by the window, watching the country unspool beneath her, a patchwork of greens and browns that was entirely alien. Each mile that passed was a mile further from everything she had ever known. She was not just moving across the country, she was moving into exile. From the airport in Portland, she took a bus, a rattling, uncomfortable vehicle that smelled of diesel and damp wool. The journey took hours, winding through lush forests in small, forgotten towns. The sky grew dark, and a persistent drizzle began to fall, blurring the world outside her window into a watercolor of greens and grays. She finally arrived in Havenwood, a town that was little more than a crossroads with a gas station, a general store, and a handful of houses. The bus pulled away, its red taillights disappearing into the misty darkness, leaving her standing alone under the flickering yellow light of a single street lamp. The address on the deed was for a plot of land 2 miles outside of town, down a dirt road called Sparrow Lane. There were no more buses, no taxis. With a deep, weary sigh, Elara picked up her suitcases. The wheels rattled and struggled against the gravel shoulder of the road as she began to walk. The air was cool and smelled of pine and wet earth. It was a clean, wild smell, so different from the manicured lawns and exhaust fumes of her old life. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the thin beam of the small flashlight she carried. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every hoot of a distant owl, sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. She was a city woman, a woman of soft carpets and central heating. This wilderness was not her world. She felt fragile, exposed, and utterly out of place. After what felt like an eternity, she found it. A rickety, faded sign, half swallowed by ivy, read, Sparrow Lane. The dirt road was more of a muddy track, a narrow path carved between towering fir trees. She dragged her suitcases down the lane, the mud sucking at her sensible shoes. And then she saw it. Set back from the road in a small, overgrown clearing was the camper. It was worse than she had imagined. The 1978 Starcraft Wanderer was a fossil from a forgotten era. Its white and avocado green stripes were faded and peeling, covered in a patina of grime and moss. The tires were flat, the rubber cracked and sinking into the soft earth. One of the windows was cracked, a spider web of fractures distorting the reflection of the dark trees. It looked abandoned, broken, a sad metal carcass left to rust in the woods. This was her inheritance, her home. A wave of despair so powerful it almost buckled her knees washed over her. This was not a new beginning, it was a grave. Tears she had held back for a month finally came, hot and silent, tracking paths through the dust on her cheeks. She stood in the cold, damp darkness, a 71-year-old woman with 2 suitcases and a broken camper, and she wept for the life she had lost and the horrifying future she now faced. After a few moments, the tears subsided, replaced by a grim, bone-deep exhaustion. Crying would not fix the flat tires or the cracked window. It would not make a warm bed appear. She took a deep breath, the cold, pine-scented air a shock to her system. She had to see inside. She had to know the full extent of the disaster. She approached the camper, her flashlight beam dancing over its dilapidated exterior. The door was stiff, but the old brass key Mr. Thompson had given her fit the lock. With a groan of protest from the rusty hinges, the door swung inward, releasing a musty, stale smell of trapped air and decay. She hesitated at the threshold, her heart pounding. She was afraid of what she would find inside. Spiders, rats, mold, a complete and total ruin. Steeling herself, she pointed her flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through the gloom, and Elara's breath caught in her throat. It was not what she expected. It was not a ruin at all. The interior was spotless. The small space was a time capsule, perfectly preserved. The shag carpet, a hideous shade of orange, was clean and plush. The wood-paneled walls gleamed, and the small kitchenette, with its miniature avocado green appliances, looked as if it had never been used. The floral-patterned cushions on the dining nook benches were plump and unfaded. It was strange, impossibly strange. How could the outside be so decayed while the inside was so pristine? She stepped inside, her shoes sinking into the soft carpet. She ran a hand along the small countertop. No dust. It felt clean, solid. She moved further in, to the small area at the back that served as a bedroom. A bed, neatly made with a dated but immaculate quilt, took up most of the space. On the pillow sat a single, sealed envelope. Her name was written on the front in Arthur's familiar, slightly shaky handwriting. Her heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was something more than a camper. This was a message. She sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress surprisingly firm and comfortable beneath her. With trembling fingers, she tore open the envelope. Inside was a letter, several pages long. She began to read. "My dearest Elara," it started. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and I can only imagine the hurt and confusion you must be feeling. Please forgive me. Forgive me for the public humiliation, for the apparent cruelty of my will. It was the only way." Elara's eyes filled with fresh tears, but these were not tears of despair. They were tears of confusion, of a dawning, fragile hope. "I knew my children," the letter continued. "I knew their greed. For years I watched them, saw the way they looked at you, the way they looked at everything I owned. They were not waiting for me to die, they were waiting to inherit. Had I left you a house or a fortune, they would have found a way to take it from you. They would have contested the will, they would have harassed you, bullied you until you had nothing. I could not protect you from them in life, Elara. I was a coward. I avoided conflict. I bought peace. It is my deepest regret. But I could, I hoped, protect you in death." Elara paused, rereading the last sentences. A coward. He had known. He had seen it all, his own weakness, their cruelty, her silent suffering. "This camper," he wrote, "is more than it appears. They will think it is junk. They will laugh. They will be satisfied that you have been cast aside with nothing. They will not look twice. They will not be curious. Their greed is vast, but their imagination is small. They see value only in things that glitter." She looked around the small, clean, dated interior. It was nice, but it was hardly a fortune. She continued reading. "The value is not in what you see, my love. It is in what is hidden. Do you remember the little wooden bird? I carved it for you years ago. I told you it was a sparrow. It is not. It is a key." Section. Elara's hand instinctively went to her pocket, where she had kept the small carving. She pulled it out, studying it under the beam of her flashlight. A key? It looked like nothing more than a small, decorative object. "Look at the wall behind the dining nook," the letter instructed. "There is a small, almost invisible seam in the wood paneling, just below the window. There you will find a small hole, the size of the bird's tail. The bird is not just a key, Elara. It is the key." Her breath hitched. She scrambled over to the dining nook, her flashlight beam shaking. She ran her fingers over the wood paneling, feeling for a seam. There. A faint, almost imperceptible line. And just below the window, a tiny, dark pinprick of a hole. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was insane. It was something out of a spy novel. With a hand that shook so badly she could barely control it, she took the wooden bird and inserted its pointed tail into the hole. It fit perfectly. She turned it, just a quarter turn to the right, as one would turn a key. There was a soft, satisfying click. For a moment, nothing happened. Disappointment, sharp and bitter, lanced through her. It was just a trick, a sentimental game. And then she heard it, a low, hydraulic hiss. The entire back wall of the camper, the wall with the bed she had just been sitting on, began to move. The bed folded silently and seamlessly up into the wall, and the entire section, the wood paneling, the fake window, everything began to slide sideways, disappearing into the side of the camper with a whisper of perfectly engineered machinery. Elara stood frozen, her flashlight dropping from her nerveless fingers and rolling across the orange shag carpet. The space where the bedroom had been was now a gaping opening, and beyond it, bathed in a soft, automatic glow that flickered to life, was something impossible. The camper was not a camper. It was a facade, an entryway. The small, dilapidated vehicle was merely the front porch to a much larger, much more sophisticated structure. The opening revealed a long, wide corridor with polished steel floors and smooth white walls. It was not a vehicle, it was a habitat. A state-of-the-art, custom-built mobile home that had been cleverly disguised as a piece of junk. The old camper was just a shell, a brilliant piece of camouflage wrapped around a core of immense value and ingenuity. She stepped through the opening, her feet silent on the cool metal floor. She was in a spacious, beautifully designed living area. A sleek, modern kitchen with stainless steel appliances curved along one wall. A comfortable-looking sofa and armchairs were arranged around a low table. Bookshelves, filled with books, were built seamlessly into the walls. The air was fresh and clean, circulated by a silent ventilation system. She walked down the corridor, passing a door that led to a large, elegant bathroom with a full-size shower and a marble vanity. At the very back was a bedroom. Not a cramped cot, but a true bedroom, with a queen-size bed, soft, indirect lighting, and a large screen on the wall that currently displayed a tranquil image of a forest canopy. This was not just a place to live. This was a sanctuary, a fortress, a secret world built by a man who had been a coward in life, but a genius in his foresight. She returned to the main living area and saw a small desk built into an alcove. On the desk was a sleek, thin laptop and another envelope. She opened it. Inside were more pages of Arthur's letter. "This is your home now, Elara," he had written. "Completely off-grid. Solar panels on the roof, a state-of-the-art water filtration system that pulls from the atmosphere, satellite internet. It's self-contained, self-sufficient, and most importantly, invisible. The exterior is a shell I had commissioned. It's designed to look worthless, to degrade naturally over time, to be utterly uninteresting. No one will ever know what's inside." He went on to explain the finances. "The laptop will give you access to a series of accounts I set up for you years ago, in your maiden name. It's not the Ashworth fortune. That I had to leave to them to avoid suspicion. This is my own money, accumulated quietly over decades, from patents and investments my children knew nothing about. It is more than enough. It is freedom." Elara sank into one of the armchairs, the soft leather cool against her skin. She felt dizzy, her world tilting on its axis for the second time in a month. The first time had been a plunge into darkness. This was a staggering, blinding ascent into the light. But there was more. The last page of the letter was different. The tone shifted from loving and explanatory to something harder, something colder. "I have given you peace and security, my love, but I have also given you justice, should you ever need it. In the safe behind the bookshelf, the combination is your birthday, you will find a set of documents. They are leverage. For years, Richard has been skimming from the company, moving money through offshore accounts. Clara has been involved in art forgery, replacing originals from my collection with fakes and selling the real ones. I have the proof. Bank records, emails, sworn affidavits from people they wronged. I gathered it all, just in case." Elara's hands started to shake. "I hope you never have to use it," Arthur wrote. "I hope they leave you in peace, believing you are destitute. I hope you can simply live your life, free from them. But I know my children. Their greed is a sickness, and it may not be satisfied with the fortune I left them. If they ever come for you, if they ever try to harm you or take what is yours, you will be ready. You will not be the victim, Elara. Not anymore. The letter ended with a final, simple sentence. Live well, my love. It is the only thing I have ever truly wanted for you. Elara folded the letter, her movements slow and reverent. The image of Arthur in her mind shifted. He was not the weak, conflict-avoidant man she had married. He was a quiet strategist, a patient architect of a grand, secret design. His love had not been one of convenience. It had been a deep, protective, and profoundly patient love. He had not been able to stand up to his children in life, but he had built her a fortress from which she could withstand them after his death. That night, for the first time in a month, Elara slept. It was a deep, dreamless sleep in the quiet, climate-controlled sanctuary Arthur had built for her. She awoke to the soft, simulated light of a sunrise filling the bedroom. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure of where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The will reading, the journey, the discovery. She got out of bed, her body feeling lighter than it had in years. The fear and despair that had been her constant companions were gone, replaced by a feeling she could not quite name. It felt like power. The first thing she did was explore her new home in the daylight. From the outside, the camper looked even more pathetic. The morning light revealed every patch of rust, every peeling strip of paint. It was a masterpiece of deception. Inside, the world was serene and perfect. She made coffee in the gleaming kitchen, the machine humming quietly. She sat on the sofa, sipping from a delicate porcelain cup she found in one of the cabinets, and opened the laptop. Everything was as Arthur had said. With a few clicks, she accessed the accounts. The numbers that appeared on the screen made her gasp. It was a fortune. Not the obscene dynastic wealth of the Ashworth estate, but a staggering sum nonetheless. Enough to live 100 lives in comfort and security. She found the safe behind the bookshelf, opened it with her birthday, and looked through the documents inside. It was all there. The cold, hard proof of her stepchildren's crimes, meticulously organized and authenticated. She put the documents back and closed the safe. Arthur was right. She hoped she would never have to use them. But knowing they were there was like having a shield. For the first time since she was a young woman, before she had married and sublimated her own identity, Elara asked herself a question. What did she want to do? The question was so foreign, so vast, that she had no immediate answer. For now, it was enough to simply be. To be safe. To be free. Over the next few weeks, a new routine began to form. She spent her days exploring the forest around her small clearing. She learned the names of the trees and the birds. She discovered a small, clear stream where she would sit and read for hours, the only sound the rushing of water and the whisper of the wind in the pines. The quiet, which had once felt like a void, now felt like a comfort. It was her quiet, a space she owned and controlled. She needed supplies, however. The camper was well stocked with non-perishables, but she craved fresh food. One morning, she walked the 2 miles into Havenwood. The town looked different in the daylight. It was small, but it had a rugged, honest charm. The general store was a rambling wooden building with a wide front porch. A sign above the door read, Samuel's Supplies. She stepped inside, a small bell tinkling above the door. The store was crowded with everything from canned goods and hardware to fishing tackle and flannel shirts. A man with a kind, weathered face and a thick gray beard stood behind the counter. Morning, he said, his voice warm and friendly. Don't think I've seen you around here before. Good morning, Elara replied, her voice a little hesitant. It had been weeks since she had spoken to another person. I just moved here. I'm staying out on Sparrow Lane. The man's eyebrows raised in surprise. Sparrow Lane? You mean out at the old Miller parcel? The one with that derelict camper? That's the one, Elara said, a small smile touching her lips. The man, Samuel, leaned forward, his expression concerned. Ma'am, are you all right? That place has been abandoned for decades. The camper's a wreck. It's a bit of a fixer-upper, she said, enjoying the understatement. But it's my home now. Samuel looked at her clean clothes and the quiet dignity in her posture. He seemed to sense that there was more to the story, but he was too polite to pry. "Well," he said slowly, "welcome to Havenwood. I'm Samuel. If you need anything, and I mean anything at all, you just let me know." Elara felt a warmth spread through her chest. It was a simple, human kindness, something she had not experienced in a very long time. "Thank you, Samuel. I'm Elara." She bought fresh vegetables, eggs, and a loaf of bread that was still warm from the oven. As Samuel packed her groceries, he talked about the town, the people, the changing seasons. He told her about Arthur's father, who had originally owned the land. He called him a good man, but a dreamer. He mentioned that Arthur himself had visited once, a long time ago, with a brand new camper and big plans he never followed through on. "Seemed like a nice enough fellow," Samuel said, "but a little soft, like the city hadn't prepared him for the real world." Elara nodded. It was a perfect description of the man she had known. Her weekly trips to Samuel's store became a cherished ritual. She began to feel like a part of the small community. People would nod to her on the street. They knew her as the woman in the old camper. She knew they whispered. They wondered about her story, how she had ended up there. She let them wonder. Her secret was her own, a source of quiet strength. She began to change. The timid, invisible woman who had lived in the shadows of the Ashworth mansion began to fade away. In her place, a new Elara emerged. She was still quiet, but her quietness was now a choice, a sign of contentment, not fear. She ordered new clothes online, practical things for her new life in the woods, but also elegant, comfortable pieces in rich colors she had never dared to wear before. She spent her evenings reading, listening to music, and learning. The internet gave her access to the entire world. She took online courses in botany, in art history, in literature. Her mind, which had been so long occupied with managing a household, was now free to roam, to explore, to grow. She was not just surviving, she was thriving. Months passed, turning from a cool, damp spring into a warm, golden summer. Elara had settled into her new life, into her new self. The memory of Richard and Clara, of their cruelty and condescension, had begun to fade, like a bad dream. She hoped she would never see them again. But Arthur had known his children well. Their greed was a sickness without a cure. Back in the world of mansions and inheritance, Richard and Clara were growing restless. They had their fortune, they had the houses, the art, the money, but a small, irritating question had begun to bother them. What had happened to Elara? They had expected her to call, to beg for money. They had expected to hear through the grapevine that she was in a homeless shelter or a charity home. Her complete and utter silence was unsettling. "It's strange, isn't it?" Clara said to Richard one afternoon as they sat by the pool of the Hamptons estate. "Not a word. It's like she just vanished." "Good riddance," Richard grunted, scrolling through stock prices on his phone. "She probably crawled into that tin can and expired, saved us the trouble of dealing with her." "But what if she didn't?" Clara persisted, a calculating glint in her eye. Father was sentimental. What if there was something more, some hidden account? That camper was just too theatrical. It felt like a diversion. Richard lowered his phone. He hated to admit it, but Clara had a point. Their father had been weak, but he had not been stupid. The sheer absurdity of the inheritance had felt like a deliberate statement. What if the statement was not what it seemed? "The land," Richard said slowly. "He left her the land too. What do we know about it?" They hired a private investigator. A week later, they had a report. It confirmed that Elara was living on the property in Oregon. It included grainy photos of her walking into town, of the dilapidated camper sitting in its clearing. The investigator's report concluded that she was living a destitute, hermit-like existence. Richard and Clara were relieved, and yet a seed of doubt remained. "Let's go see for ourselves," Clara said finally. "Let's fly out there. It'll be amusing at the very least, A little poverty tourism. Richard agreed. He wanted to see her. He wanted to see the despair in her eyes. He wanted to confirm, with his own senses, that she had been defeated, that they had truly won. It was a warm Tuesday in late August when Elara, returning from her morning walk, saw the car. It was a sleek, black rental sedan, utterly out of place on the muddy track of Sparrow Lane. It was parked near her clearing, and two figures were standing beside it, staring at her camper. Richard and Clara. A jolt of pure, cold adrenaline shot through her. Her first instinct was to hide, to retreat into the woods. The old Elara, the invisible woman, wanted to flee. But she was not the old Elara anymore. She stood her ground, her heart beating a steady, strong rhythm. She was in her home. She was in her fortress. She remembered Arthur's words. "You will not be the victim, Elara, not anymore." She took a deep breath and walked calmly into the clearing. Richard and Clara turned as she approached. Their faces registered a flicker of surprise. They had expected to find a broken, shuffling old woman in rags. Instead, they saw Elara, her back straight, her hair shining in the sun, dressed in simple but elegant linen trousers and a silk blouse. She looked healthy, calm, and disconcertingly serene. "Elara," Clara said, her voice tight with a mixture of shock and suspicion. "What a surprise." "You seem to be managing," Richard added, his eyes scanning her, then flicking dismissively toward the camper. "This is even more pathetic than I imagined." He kicked at one of the flat tires. "How do you live in this dump?" Elara stopped a few feet from them. She did not rise to the bait. She simply looked at them, her gaze steady and clear. "Richard, Clara," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You are trespassing. What do you want?" The directness of the question threw them off balance. They were used to her deference, her quiet acquiescence. "We were just concerned," Clara said, the lie sounding hollow even to her own ears. "We wanted to make sure you were all right." "As you can see, I am perfectly fine," Elara replied. "Now, if you'll excuse me." She started to walk toward the camper door. "Not so fast," Richard snapped, his arrogance returning. He stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "We think you're hiding something." "Hiding something?" Elara asked, her voice calm. "In here?" She gestured to the rusted shell of the camper. The absurdity of it was almost comical. "Let us see inside," Clara demanded. Elara looked from Clara's demanding face to Richard's sneering one. She saw the greed in their eyes, the insatiable hunger that drove them. They would never stop. Arthur had been right. A quiet resolve settled over her. It was time. "Very well," she said, her voice betraying no emotion. "If you insist." She walked to the camper door, the old brass key already in her hand. Richard and Clara exchanged a triumphant look. They were about to uncover her secret, to take whatever little treasure she had managed to squirrel away. Elara opened the door, swinging it wide. She stepped inside, into the perfectly preserved, kitschy 1970s interior. Richard and Clara followed, their expensive shoes sinking into the orange shag carpet. They looked around, their faces a mixture of confusion and disappointment. "It's clean," Clara said, a note of bewilderment in her voice. "It's still a dump," Richard scoffed, though he too seemed puzzled by the pristine condition of the squalid little space. "What's the big secret, Elara? Did you hide a few of Mother's old trinkets under the mattress?" Elara did not answer. She walked to the dining nook. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, carved wooden bird. Richard and Clara watched, their curiosity piqued. "What is that?" Clara asked. "Another piece of junk from Father's workshop?" Elara ignored her. She inserted the bird's tail into the hidden lock. She turned it. Click. The low, hydraulic hiss filled the small space. Richard and Clara stared, their mouths falling open in stunned disbelief, as the entire back wall of the camper began to retract. The bed folded away, the wall slid sideways, and the entrance to the hidden sanctuary was revealed, glowing with soft, welcoming light. For a full 10 seconds, there was absolute silence. Richard and Clara were paralyzed, their minds unable to process what they were seeing. The sleek, modern corridor, the polished steel floors, the glimpse of a world of impossible luxury and technology hidden within a rusted-out trailer. "What is this?" Richard whispered, his voice hoarse with shock. "This," Elara said, her voice ringing with a newfound power in the sudden silence, "is my home." She stepped through the opening into the main living area, her demeanor calm and regal. She turned to face them, framed by the entryway to her secret world. She looked like a queen on her throne. Richard and Clara stumbled forward, their faces pale with a dawning, horrified understanding. They stepped into the main habitat, their eyes wide as they took in the luxury, the technology, the sheer, breathtaking impossibility of it all. "Father," Clara breathed. "This was Father's doing." "He played us," Richard said, his voice a low, furious growl. "The old fool, he played us." His shock was rapidly turning to rage. This was wealth. This was ingenuity. This was a treasure he had been denied, and it had been given to her, to the housekeeper. "This belongs to us," he snarled, taking a step toward Elara. "All of it. It was our father's money that built this. You have no right to it." "On the contrary," Elara said, her voice dangerously quiet, "I have every right. Your father gave it to me, freely and deliberately, to protect me from you." "We'll see about that," Clara snapped, recovering her composure. "We'll get our lawyers. We'll prove you coerced him. We'll take this and we'll leave you with nothing, not even the rusty shell." They stood there, radiating entitlement and menace, confident that their money and power would, as always, win the day. They still saw her as the meek, powerless woman they had thrown out of their house. They had not yet understood the true nature of the shift in power. Elara gave them a small, sad smile. "I don't think you will," she said. She walked to the bookshelf, her movements unhurried. She entered the combination, her birthday, into a keypad that was invisible until she touched it. A section of the bookshelf swung open, revealing the safe. She opened it and removed a thick, leather-bound folio. She placed it on the low table in the center of the room. "Your father was a coward in many ways," she said, her gaze meeting theirs. "But he was also a meticulous man, and he loved me." She opened the folio. "He knew you would not be satisfied. He knew your greed would eventually lead you here. So he left me a gift, insurance." She slid a document across the table toward Richard. It was a bank statement from a Swiss account, showing a series of deposits that matched perfectly the amounts he had been embezzling from Ashworth Industries. Richard's face went white as a sheet. "Where did you get that?" he stammered. Elara then slid a set of photographs toward Clara. One showed a masterpiece, a Degas sculpture from Arthur's collection. The next showed a detailed chemical analysis proving the one currently in the Ashworth mansion was a forgery. Sections. The last was a deposition from an art dealer in Brussels, detailing how Clara had sold him the original. Sections. Clara looked as if she had been struck. "This is everything," Elara said, her voice soft but unforgiving. "The embezzlement, the forgeries, tax evasion, fraud, years of it, all documented, all authenticated, enough to send you both to prison for a very long time, enough to strip you of every last penny you inherited." She stood back, letting the weight of her words, the weight of the evidence, settle upon them. Sections. The transformation in the room was absolute. Sections. The arrogant, powerful heirs were gone. Sections. In their place were two trapped, terrified criminals. Sections. The power had shifted completely. Sections. "What do you want?" Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper. The fight was gone from him, replaced by a raw, primal fear. Elara looked at him, then at Clara. She saw them for what they were, small, hollow people, defined only by their appetites. She felt no desire for revenge. She felt no anger. She only felt a vast, weary pity. "I want you to leave," she said. "I want you to walk out of my home, get in your car, and disappear from my life. Forever." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "You will make no claim on this property. You will not speak my name. You will not make any inquiries about me. You will pretend I do not exist, just as you have always wanted to." "And if we do," Clara asked, her voice trembling, "these documents? These documents will remain in this safe," Elara said. "A copy is held by a law firm in Switzerland with instructions to release it to the authorities should any harm come to me or should you ever violate the terms of our agreement." It was a checkmate. Section a perfect, inescapable trap laid by a dead man and sprung by the woman they had underestimated. Richard and Clara looked at each other, their faces masks of defeat. They had lost, completely and utterly. Without another word, Richard turned and walked out of the sanctuary, through the 1970s facade, and out into the sunlight, which now seemed harsh and accusing. Clara hesitated for a moment, her gaze lingering on the impossible luxury she could never have. She looked at Elara, her eyes filled with a toxic cocktail of hatred, envy, and fear. Then she too turned and followed her brother. Elara stood and listened as their car doors slammed shut. She heard the engine start, the sound of tires spinning in the mud as they sped away down Sparrow Lane. And then, silence. A deep, profound, and final silence. She walked to the opening and pressed a button on the wall. With a soft hiss, the hidden wall slid back into place, the bed folding down, the fake window returning. The sanctuary was sealed once more. She was alone again. But this loneliness was different. It was not abandonment. It was peace. It was victory. In the months that followed, Elara's life truly began. The threat of her stepchildren was gone, a ghost vanquished. She was free not just from them, but from the fear they had represented for so long. She had the means, the security, and the freedom to do anything she wanted. And she discovered what she wanted was not to hide. Her fortress had served its purpose. It had been a shield, but she did not want to spend the rest of her life behind a shield. She wanted to connect. She started small. She had the flat tires on the camper shell repaired. She had the engine, which Arthur had also kept in pristine condition under a heavy tarp, serviced and brought back to life. The old Starcraft Wanderer, to the astonishment of the mechanic from the next town over, roared to life with a surprisingly healthy rumble. Then she began her project. She loved books. She loved the worlds they held, the escape and the knowledge they offered. Havenwood had no library. The nearest one was a 40-minute drive away, so Elara decided to bring the library to them. She used her vast resources to order thousands of books. New books, old books, children's books, novels, histories, biographies. She bought a second, smaller trailer, a simple cargo hauler, and had it professionally outfitted with beautiful wooden shelves, comfortable reading lights, and a simple checkout system. She painted it a warm, welcoming shade of blue. On the side, in elegant script, she painted the words, "The Sparrow Lane Bookmobile." One Saturday morning, she hitched the bookmobile to the back of the old Starcraft camper and drove into the center of Havenwood. She parked in front of Samuel's store. She opened the doors of the bookmobile, revealing the treasures within. At first, people were just curious. They peered inside, surprised to see the rows upon rows of books. Samuel was the first one to come over. He looked from the bookmobile to Elara, who was sitting on a small folding chair, a gentle smile on her face. "Elara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "what is all this?" "It's a library," she said simply, "for everyone. It's free, of course." Word spread quickly through the small town. Children came, their eyes wide with wonder. Teenagers, who usually lounged around with bored expressions, were drawn in by the graphic novels and fantasy series. Adults browsed the new bestsellers and the timeless classics. Elara had found her purpose. She was no longer the invisible woman. She was the library lady, the woman who had brought magic to their small, forgotten town. She expanded her route, taking the bookmobile to other small, isolated communities in the surrounding mountains, places forgotten by county budgets and modern infrastructure. She brought them not just books, but a connection to the wider world. She brought them hope. She still lived in her secret sanctuary, her invisible fortress. It was her private world, her place of peace and renewal. But she no longer lived in hiding. The battered old camper, once a symbol of her humiliation, had become a symbol of her new life. It was the vehicle that carried her on her mission, its humble exterior a perfect disguise for the quiet, powerful woman at the wheel. Years passed. Elara grew older, her hair turning from silver to a soft, shining white. Her bookmobile became an institution, a beloved part of the fabric of the community. She never heard from Richard or Clara again. She sometimes wondered what had become of them, living in their gilded cages, their fortunes built on greed and deceit. She hoped they had found some measure of peace, but she doubted it. Their kind of hunger was never satisfied. One crisp autumn afternoon, as she was packing up the bookmobile, a young girl, one of her most loyal patrons, handed her a drawing. It was a picture of the old camper pulling the blue bookmobile. The camper was drawn with peeling paint in a cracked window, just as it was in reality. But the artist had drawn golden light pouring from the driver's side window, and behind the wheel, she had drawn a smiling woman with a crown on her head. Elara looked at the drawing, and tears welled in her eyes. Tears of gratitude, tears of joy. She had been discarded, devalued, and cast into the wilderness. She had been given what the world thought was worthless. But in that worthless thing, she had found everything. She had found security. She had found justice. And most importantly, in the quiet woods of Havenwood, surrounded by books and the kindness of strangers, the invisible woman had finally found herself. She had found peace. A peace that was not bought or borrowed, but built with her own two hands. A peace as strong and as secret as the sanctuary she called home. Her life had not been an opera. It had been a quiet, simple song. And after a lifetime of listening to others, she had finally learned to sing her own tune.